Making a video game feels a little like engineering a time machine. I get a chance to transport the player to a different time and place. In the case of Willard, the visual style aims to take gamers back to the 4th console generation, a time when games like Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana loomed large. But I want to start the action even further back. What if time branched during the early 1980s? What if, in that brief period of technological advancement, before the advent of a World Wide Web, computers became self-aware? What if these newly awakened technological toddlers invaded an idyllic fantasy world that was totally unprepared to defend themselves? Well, that's the world in which Willard finds himself. And in this devlog, we're going to look at how I'm adding enemies and combat into my dream game. Before I get into combat, there's a few updates I should show you since Devlog 0. In that video, I showed how I started designing my first level and got my player moving, jumping, and climbing ledges. As you can see here, I've added a few visuals since then, for both good and ill. I created some ruins to fill in the background and create a sense of mystery about what this world has lost. I also added these fir trees in the foreground and back. While I like the depth they add to the level, I quickly decided the visual style just didn't match my game. You'll have to bear with them for a little while, as it took me a couple days to figure this out. I also added a breeze to the game. This is just a series of rectangles with colliders, and whenever they hit a tree, they tell it to play a breeze animation. When a breeze reaches the edge of the map, it teleports back to the beginning and starts over. You can also speed up or slow down this breeze depending on the weather. One other important thing I had to add before I could put in enemies was to get my player fully functioning. Last video I talked about movement, jumping, and ledge climbing, but since that time, I've now got Willard grabbing walls, sliding down walls, and jumping from walls. Okay, so the jumping took a little work. I had to make sure that after a short period of time, his gravity went back to heavy gravity. Otherwise, his wall jump would send him into orbit permanently each time. I've also added in an anima meter. This works much like stamina in games like Breath of the Wild. When the bar runs out, the player can no longer sprint or climb, and you'll be able to find gear and upgrades that increases this stat throughout the game. I've called it anima though, rather than stamina, as it's also connected to other aspects of Willard, like his anima cannon. This is a ranged weapon and tool that will become really important later in the game. Finally, I added a crouch state where I can press down, or if Willard detects an open space that's too short to stand in, he'll automatically go into a crouch. With this, he can explore new areas and also has the ability to duck below certain enemy attacks. Now, what I really want to tell you about is the unique enemies I'm creating and how my processes work to try to make Willard combat ready. First, however, I feel like I should explain a little about the nuts and bolts of how combat works. I started with unarmed combat. I began by creating an animation for my punch. I'll show more on this in a moment. But then I use animation events so I can perfectly time different elements of the attack. For example, each time I punch, you can see that on this frame, I tell the player to lunge forward. On this one, I lock his ability to flip horizontally. That way, once I commit to an attack, I'll briefly lose the ability to turn around. This frame here is when the attack fully extends, and so at this moment, I tell my code to deal damage. Dealing damage is done with an invisible circle that gets cast out. Each attack will have a different range for its circle, and if the player detects an enemy inside of that circle, the code will tell the enemy to take damage. I've also added a combo system. For now, it's simply just if you press the attack button during the final 10 frames of an attack, it triggers an uppercut follow-up, which does a little extra damage, in this case 4 instead of 3. Right now I'm just using my fist, and you can see here that it's fairly customizable. I can give it up to 3 attacks for the combo, and each one will have its own sound effect, damage amount, knockback power, etc. To test all this, I put an enemy into the level and set him up so that he would flash when he takes damage. Here you can see an early version of my attack. Now I already mentioned the anima cannon, and I wanted to make sure that I integrated this weapon into each step of my combat development. So I made an animation and set things up so that whenever Willard shoots, it fires out a projectile. This definitely needed some visual feedback, and I also want to give it the ability to stun enemies. So I made this electrocution animation and applied it whenever the anima projectile hits an enemy. This is where life started to get complicated. I quickly realized how jarring it would be if Willard was in the middle of a run and then I hit shoot and it jumped to the beginning of a shoot animation where his legs were in a different place altogether. I realized I was going to need to separate the top and bottom halves of my character so that whatever state of walking he was in, I could trigger the anima for the top half and have it just continue along the bottom while starting a new animation for the top. This allows him to shoot from crouching, shooting, jumping, wall sliding, whatever. This meant that every frame of each animation had to work together. Here you can see that I was getting close, but depending on when I shoot, the bottom and top wouldn't quite match up. This was a slow, iterative process. And I also had to match up the animations for shooting while climbing and wall crouching. It was a lot. I continued to add to the evolution of my combat, however. I gave my enemy its own state machine, very similar to the players. One of the first steps was to add a bunch of checks. Here you can see that he's got a large check to look for potential targets, a smaller one so he knows when he's close enough to attack, and a medium one that tells him when he hits a wall. Finally, there's another that checks downward just in front of him. If it ever fails to detect ground, he knows he's reached a ledge and should turn around. Here you can see the enemy's animator, and similar to my players, he simply plays different animations for different states. Most recently, I added this damage state. Once he finishes this, he will head into a stun state. Here you can see the damage state in action. Next, I wanted my enemies to be able to jump small obstacles, but I didn't quite get the calculations correct. I tweaked the numbers, but now he only sometimes made the jump. This took a ridiculous amount of time to get just right, but I did eventually get it working. Now my enemy was able to patrol and avoid small obstacles, as well as keep from falling down ledges. He could also detect the player, which would send him into a charge mode. The player can be damaged via melee attacks and charges. Additionally, if you trick the enemy into slamming into a wall, he can briefly go to a stunned state, which makes him easier to attack. Also added a damage state to the player. The animation still needs work, but you can at least visually tell now when he's getting hurt. Now that both the player and enemy could be hurt, I needed to add something to the death. I added a general particle effect to the enemy, as well as some spare parts that could spawn in on death. Definitely makes defeating an enemy more satisfying when you watch its debris go flying in all directions. Now, I have some ideas about how I'm going to handle player death, but I'm not ready to implement that system yet. So in the meantime, I wanted some sort of indicator when the player dies. Thought it might be fun to add a bit of a ragdoll effect. This was way harder to get right than I thought it would be. I went through a lot of iterations, and some worked better than others. Others were just plain disasters. Still not totally happy with it, but this is mostly placeholder for now anyways. At least it most often looks kind of fun when the player spirals upward on death and then lands in a death state. Next up was sound effects. Now these are just placeholders, but wow, already, even with just bad sound effects, it's amazing how much more it feels like a video game. You can see that I also have an early version of my player's death pose here. Alright, now for this prototype, I really wanted to get some variety to my enemies. I'm still new at coding enemy AI, so I thought I'd keep the enemies relatively simple, but give them enough difference that I'd be able to learn something new from each one that I coded. My first enemy is the CRT robot. Cathode ray tube monitors dominated the computer scene in the 80s and 90s, and this guy is especially inspired by the Apple IIe machines that populated public school computer labs during this time. He's sort of like the Goomba of the game. He patrols back and forth and has two simple attacks, melee strikes and a charge attack done at high speed. If you can time your evasions just right, you can trick him into running into walls and entering a brief stunned state. One key element of combat in Willard is that I want it to be strategic. Even the most basic enemies will take multiple hits to destroy and will always pose at least a minor threat to the player. Additionally, encountering these enemies in large numbers will always be dangerous. That said, we need more than just Goomba-likes. So next, I added my first ranged enemy. I thought it'd be fun to create a mech based on the old home computers of the 1980s. This guy's heavily inspired by machines like the IBM 5150, the first real modern home computer, and it formed the basis for home PCs for years after it's released. Now, this bad boy stalks about on mech legs and fires 5.5-inch floppy disks at unwary travelers. Up close, he also has a melee kick attack that discourages the player from lingering within close range. Verticality is going to be important in Willard, as your journey will often include climbing up into the mountains. For this reason, I decided to add a flying enemy as the final baddie for this prototype. Inspiration for this guy came from two different sources. The first was the Osborne 1, the first successful portable computer, and the Motorola Dynatac 8000X, the classic brick phone that viewers of Saved by the Bell will recognize instantly. This enemy sustains airborne status through bursts of jet power. He patrols about between selected points in the sky, but if the player comes in range, he'll swoop down to melee attack from above. Now, this isn't all I've been up to in the last little while, but this video is getting on, so I'll wrap things up here. Next video, I want to show you how I've added weapons for my player, as well as how I've added buildings that you can stock up with goods, defend, and watch get destroyed. I'm getting close to having a short playable loop for exploring the world and defending your village, and I plan to tell you all about that in the next video. Until that time, let me know what you think down in the comments section. Hope to see you in the next video, but until that time, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.